What do you do when confronted with the realization that life is utterly meaningless, that the universe is cold and uncaring, that what we do and who we are is unimportant? Many throughout history have presented their own ideas and solutions to these questions, but Peak provides a slightly different answer. Rather than finding fulfillment in your situation or completely giving up, Peak tells us to simply keep climbing. Hello and welcome back to Cognizant Pixels, where we take very silly things very seriously. And today that very silly thing is Peak, a game that has taken the internet by storm recently. Reminiscent of other recent co-op games, Peak breaks the mold by deciding that the most fun you can have is by climbing a giant mountain. But while Peak may seem like a small, simple, and straightforward game, I can assure you that it is not. Peak is a manifestation of changes within our own zeitgeist, a psychological and philosophical take on how we live our lives. It is a game with as much depth as it has height. You may not believe me when I say all this, but that's okay. I don't expect you to believe me right off the bat. That would defeat the purpose of this video after all. So, without further ado, let me explain. To first understand the game, we need to understand the story behind it, because this is a situation where the psychological state of the actual developers has everything to do with the game and what it represents. Enter AgroCrab and Landfall, two very interesting developers in their own rights. Landfall is well known for making many quirky games like Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, so Peak is certainly their modus operandi. However, AgroCrab is a different beast, and the story of how this game came to be starts with them. According to AgroCrab, they had been working on a sequel to their first ever game, Going Under. But after working on it for 3 years and facing burnout, as well as losing funding, they had to abandon it. To quote them, "Turns out it's a lot harder to make fun games if you're not having fun doing it." Now, the only other game that AgroCrab has made at this point is Another Crab's Treasure, and while it did do much better than anticipated, it still wasn't enough to keep their studio from facing financial hardship in 2024. So losing funding and having to give up on their third game would understandably be a big blow to them. Luckily though, they had become friends with Landfall over the years, and Landfall told them about a time they went to South Korea for a month-long game jam, a challenge to make an entire game in a short amount of time. Landfall and AgroCrab joined forces to do this again, and so Peak was born. It's a pretty interesting story, especially considering just how viral the game has become. But what I find more interesting is how Peak as a game represents something. I mean, you are quite literally struggling to climb a mountain, and that feels reminiscent of how this game came to be in the first place. AgroCrab themselves, in a studio update video, stated that they felt like they had to make a shift for their sustainability as a studio, which is why they focus on smaller projects like Peak and an unreleased game called Crashout Crew. So while this is most definitely reading too much into this, I certainly think that Peak is representative of how AgroCrab has had to pick themselves back up again after falling, and now they're climbing back up the mountain, this time with the help of friends like Landfall. And with that comes another idea, about how Peak represents the utter futility and meaninglessness of life, and why we continue to climb anyway. I don't think this is much of a stretch either, as this sort of thing fits AgroCrab's modus operandi. Going Under is a satirical game about exploring the ruins of failed tech startups, and Another Crab's Treasure's entire story and gameplay revolves around pollution within the ocean. Suffice to say, they're no stranger to engaging with deeper themes than what would otherwise be silly games. What exactly am I referring to here with Peak? Well, basically, we need to talk about Albert Camus and his philosophy of absurdism. Okay, yeah, I get it. Getting into philosophy on a video about Peak of all things definitely seems like an it's not that deep kind of moment. But it is. Like I said, we take silly things seriously here, and I meant it. Let's talk about Albert Camus and his philosophy of absurdism now. There's a good chance you've heard of this before, at the very least via the phrase, "one must imagine Sisyphus as happy." This refers to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, who was punished to roll a boulder up a mountain for the rest of his afterlife, only for the boulder to roll back down to the bottom, just for him to start over again. Unfortunately, the phrase doesn't fully encapsulate Camus' absurdism, but we'll get to that in a moment. See, Camus was born in 1913 and had a lot of opinions during his life. He started dealing with the absurd with his essay titled The Myth of Sisyphus, which is where that earlier quote comes from. Camus explains the absurd as the, quote, confrontation between human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The universe is unfeeling and unintelligent, and human needs and wants are inherently meaningless in such a universe. making everything about us and our world absurd to care about. To quote Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Camus argues that human beings cannot escape asking the question, what is the meaning of existence? Camus, however, denies that there is an answer to this question, and rejects every scientific, teleological, metaphysical, or human-created end that would provide an adequate answer. Thus, while accepting that human beings inevitably seek to understand life's purpose, Camus takes the skeptical position that the natural world, the universe, and the human enterprise remain silent about any such purpose. But since there is no inherent meaning to existence, we have to bear the burden of that notion. It creates a sense of emptiness within us, moving through life with no real purpose, just going through the motions. It also gives us a sense of freedom. Since nothing really matters, we're free to do whatever we want without caring. Now, that line of thought can be just a little bit dangerous, but let's not think too hard about that yet. Now, this is only really the first part of Camus' absurdism, and is probably the one you're most familiar with if you've ever heard of this before. There is more to it, but we'll be getting into that later in the video. See, Camus believed that it's absurd to continually seek meaning in life when there isn't any, and you may think that the answer to this would be to just end it all. But Camus disagrees, claiming that the absurd is an experience that must be lived through. This means that Camus' Sisyphus example, we must imagine Sisyphus as happy because it means that we can still find joy in living a meaningless existence. If you've ever played Peak alone, you know that it's an entirely different experience compared to playing with others. Some of the items are just straight up worthless when playing by yourself, and there's a lot of things that you can do with other players that you can't do alone, like boosting and grabbing teammates. Suffice to say, Peak is a lonely experience, and in some ways a lot more difficult when you're alone. But it was certainly an intended experience though, with there even being the Lone Wolf achievement for reaching the peak in a solo expedition. And so with this solo expedition is where we see absurdism begin to shine. Peak is not an easy game, and reaching the peak alone presents its own challenges, so there will be some struggle if you play this way. There will be a frequent occurrence where you will reach so close to the end only for the boulder to fall back down again. Not to mention, once you do reach the peak, there's ascensions afterwards that can make the game harder. The map changes daily and items spawn differently with each run, so you never really do reach the end, now do you? So what's the point of playing if there is no true end and no real resolution? There's only really the emotional satisfaction of 1. Actually playing, and 2. Reaching the peak. Camus would say that just the act of playing Peak is a meaningless endeavor, but I would argue that there's even less meaning with Peak compared to other games based on everything we just mentioned. And yet we keep climbing, and I believe this is because Peak has made a slight change to the absurdist philosophy, but an important one. We no longer must imagine Sisyphus as happy, he simply is happy, and that is no longer up to interpretation or debate. Why? Well, this is where the psychology of the matter begins to come into play, specifically the psychology behind solitude and self-determination. You see, humans are social creatures, but most of us crave some amount of solitude from time to time. Being alone usually has negative connotations around it, and it is true that too much solitude for too long can be very detrimental to your mental health. But when used appropriately, it can actually be extremely beneficial. Solitude has been linked to increased life satisfaction, emotional regulation, and reduced stress. Cultural opinions on solitude can shape how we feel about it though, with American samples favoring and linking extroversion to life satisfaction. But in non-North American populations like Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom, this isn't the case. American society views being alone as unnatural, pathological, and dangerous, but being able to be alone is an important skill to have, and it's impossible to completely avoid it. How we think and feel about solitude, therefore, has a large impact on how it affects us. If you go into it believing that it is okay or even beneficial, you'll have a more positive experience with it instead of a negative one. And with that being said, the experience of climbing the mountain alone in Peak is highly reminiscent of something we already do as people: solo hiking and the wilderness solo experience. The silence and solitude of being in nature is a pretty ubiquitous part of the human experience, and has been for hundreds of years. I'm sure I don't need to explain what solo hiking is, as that's pretty self-explanatory, but the wilderness solo experience is a bit different. It's defined as a retreat from daily life, where the individual spends a prescribed time alone and in silence, in the wilderness, to contemplate the meaning and purpose of life, in a way that is difficult to do in everyday settings. Silence and solitude are core aspects of this experience, and they are what allows us to learn about ourselves and our lives while in these scenarios. Both the wilderness solo experience and solo hiking are correlated with positive impacts on mental health when done correctly, including enhanced autonomy, competence, relatedness, and personal growth. This is where self-determination theory comes into play. SDT claims that our behavior is self-motivated and self-determined, with us all having three basic psychological needs, those being autonomy, competence, and relatedness. With that in mind, it becomes a little more clear as to why peak is so enjoyable. The ability to have control over our own decisions and master something is something we all strive for, and peak allows us to engage with that either alone or with others. This is why I believe peak is saying Sisyphus is definitively happy, because the experience of hiking and climbing on your own and reaching the end, whether it be in a game or real life, is something we already have a craving to do. It provides us with those feelings of autonomy and competence. And even when alone, relatedness can be fulfilled by being out in nature. So in the context of absurdism, peak is representative of an absurd experience, but one that has the potential to be meaningful to ourselves psychologically. But that doesn't mean the meaning is inherent to climbing the mountain, it just means that the meaning is chosen by the player or the person climbing. Like how Camus argues that meaning is not found in the universe but made in spite of it, peak offers the opportunity to engage in the same futile repetition of Sisyphus and also derive value from that repetition. The climb is not a means to an end, but the end itself. Sisyphus has to be happy because you're happy playing the game. In this way, peak goes beyond the usual progression in games. Instead of success being defined by completion or reward, peak's solo climb represents living with the absurd condition. There's no real glory, no reward, no inherent meaning. Not even any true completion, only the choice you make to keep climbing. But obviously peak is not intended to be a primarily solo experience, with all the marketing in the game itself having a heavy focus on playing with your friends, which is why it's commonly referred to as a friend slop game. Oh yeah, we're gonna have to talk about friend slop games real quick, mostly because I've seen some interesting vitriol surrounding them online, and I personally find that interesting. Don't worry though, it's still important for what we're about to talk about afterwards. Hey, before we continue, if you're enjoying this so far, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm really enjoying making videos and would love to have more people join this little community that we're building. Alright, back to friend slop games. Even if you've never heard the term before, you already know what friend slop games are. Know Your Meme defines them as a humorous and derogatory slang term describing video games primarily meant to be played together with friends. This typically includes cooperative horror games like Lethal Company, but lately these games have been expanding outside of that niche. Usually friend slop games will feature time limits and lack of an overarching narrative, which is why Peak technically fits the bill in a lot of ways. It's also a pretty simple game overall, which makes sense given what we've already talked about regarding its development. With that being said though, I take issue with the idea of referring to Peak as a friend slop game in a derogatory way. While it does have many similarities to some of the less than stellar options within this genre, I believe that Peak is an extremely original and creative game. And its simplicity is why we're able to have conversations like this. It isn't trying to replicate anyone, it's being its own thing while still leaving space for discussion. It even has its own modding scene, and Landfall has always had a pretty positive relationship with modders of their games. The official Discord even has its own channel dedicated to it. Friend slop games fulfill their own niche though, and many of them do it well. It's understandable that people want to be able to play some mindless games that allow them to have some wacky fun with their friends. Peak, being a multiplayer game designed to be played with your friends, is still a major component of why it's so popular, and why I decided to make this video in the first place. That aspect of companionship and struggling together is what makes it brilliant for what we're discussing today, and it's the main reason why it's so representative of absurdism as a whole. That may sound a bit confusing since all I've talked about so far is the individual experience of the game and absurdism, but that's because there's a big part of absurdism that I've neglected to talk about. Human solidarity. Okay, so here's the thing. When I was discussing absurdism earlier in the video, I kinda sorta neglected to mention one major problem with it. That is, if everything is meaningless and absurd, that includes morality. Yay. Camus' early works featured people living with the knowledge of how everything was absurd and unfortunately made them look pretty terrible. They weren't necessarily psychopathic, but had a level of apathy towards everything that I wouldn't blame you if you thought they were psychopathic. I mentioned earlier that the idea of having the freedom to do whatever we want without caring is a dangerous way to think. If we all went through life like that, there probably wouldn't be much of a society left to live in. Camus, however, was a smart guy. I knew something didn't really work here. Even if someone realizes that everything is absurd, that doesn't automatically make it to where they don't cry at their mother's funeral. And yes, that's a real plot point in one of his early works. There's still a part of us saying that we should care, a part of us holding on to our own morality, and Camus came to a realization. Life is meaningless, but you can take solace in the fact that it's meaningless for everyone else too. In Camus' later works like The Plague and The Rebel, human solidarity began to become central themes. Don't get me wrong, these aren't exactly happy, feel-good stories, but they do show that hope, and to an extent meaning, can be found in the realization that we're in this together. In The Plague, Camus shows that even in the face of senseless suffering, it's not the search for ultimate meaning that saves us. Instead, it's the decision to act in solidarity. The protagonist knows he can't stop the plague, but fights it anyway, because there's no shame in preferring happiness. This is no longer the individual and solitary person against the absurd. If life is meaningless for me, that means it's also meaningless for you, and that means that neither one of us has to deal with the absurdity of it all alone. We can do it together. Human solidarity, therefore, becomes the way we cope with the absurdity of life. By relying on each other with a shared understanding of absurdity, we find meaning amongst each other. Meaning becomes born from meaningless, simply because we both realize and understand it. But this begs the question, psychologically speaking, is human solidarity enough to find meaning in life and, even better, self-actualization? Well, let's shift gears and talk about self-actualization real quick, because something tells me that good old Abraham Maslow has a few things to say about it, specifically with his hierarchy of needs. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is very frequently misunderstood, but I'll try to point out any common misconceptions as we go along. On the surface, it seems that Maslow's theories on self-actualization would be contradictory to absurdism, as self-actualization implies that an individual finds fulfillment and meaning on their own. But according to Maslow, self-actualizing people are, quote, people who have developed or are developing to the full stature of which they are capable. These potentialities may be either idiosyncratic or species-wide, so that the self in self-actualization must not have too individualistic a flavor. This tells us that self-actualization actually involves both the self and others. Therefore, it's not possible to reach self-actualization without human solidarity. Now, some believe that Maslow's hierarchy is a step-by-step process, but in reality, it's a little different. Maslow said it himself. So far, our theoretical discussion may have given the impression that these 5 sets of needs are somehow in such terms as the following. If one need is satisfied, then another emerges. This statement might give the false impression that a need must be satisfied 100% before the next need emerges. In actual fact, most members of our society who are normal are partially satisfied in all their basic needs and partially unsatisfied in all their basic needs at the same time. A more realistic description of the hierarchy would be in terms of decreasing percentages of satisfaction as we go up the hierarchy of prepotency. For instance, to assign arbitrary figures for the sake of illustration, it is as if the average citizen is satisfied perhaps 85% of physiological needs, 70% of safety needs, 50% in love needs, 40% in self-esteem needs, and 10% in self-actualization needs. This means that, technically, you don't have to have all of your needs met to reach self-actualization. Therefore, having human solidarity is potentially a viable way to reach self-actualization on its own, even within Maslow's hierarchy. In fact, we can see that our personal relationships are exactly what allow us to not just survive, but thrive. The scientific consensus is that deep and meaningful relationships are important to human flourishing. In fact, having meaningful relationships is a stronger predictor of mortality than several other lifestyle behaviors like smoking and physical activity. Our relationships with others allow us to cope successfully with adversity, as well as participate in opportunities for growth and fulfillment in the absence of adversity. They help keep us from feeling the full negative effects of stress and even emerge from stressful events in a way that helps us flourish because of or despite said events. So human solidarity is not only able to provide us a sense of meaning in a meaningless world, but can verifiably allow us to reach a sense of fulfillment. Not only that, but this human solidarity in the face of adversity can actively allow us to grow and thrive as people. So while Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Camus' absurdism may seem contradictory, it is possible to strike a balance between them. If we go in with the understanding that self-actualization is just as much about our interpersonal relationships as it is about the individual self, then that means that Camus' human solidarity applies here. Both empirically and philosophically, human solidarity is necessary to find meaning and fulfillment within a meaningless world. Side note, I'm pretty sure Nietzsche has a similar concept in some of his writings, but I only read some of his stuff once in college and I have a headache just remembering that, so feel free to go down that rabbit hole yourself if you're interested. But this is why Peak being a friend slop game is important, because none of this would apply if it was only focused on the solo experience. Peak doesn't just show us why we keep climbing alone, it shows us why we keep climbing together. It took the entire video to get here, but now we can finally talk about the core aspect of Peak, climbing together. Sure, you can climb alone, and if you're like me and you don't have any friends, then it may be your only choice. But that isn't what the game is primarily designed for. We touched on it earlier, but everything about the game is designed around the idea that you have others with you. The mechanics, items, and marketing all reflect the intentions that the developers had with this game. It's why the game is sometimes considered friend slop. When you climb the mountain together, something just clicks. There's chaos, laughs, help, and even trolling. Suddenly, whether or not you make it to the top doesn't really matter near as much compared to doing it alone. It's like the old saying, it's about the journey, not the destination. So when Camus tells us that a solitary Sisyphus must be happy, and then tells us that we can find happiness with one another, Peak takes that literally. Instead of one Sisyphus, there are now 4, all working together to reach the top. It's easier to endure the absurdity and futility of something like this when someone is right there with you, laughing with you, and helping support you along the way. Reaching the peak then becomes something bittersweet. It provides a sense of completion and accomplishment, sure, but it also marks the end of that time spent with those along the way. That's because Peak, like Camus' later writings, isn't just about the individual struggle against the absurd. It's about what happens when that struggle becomes collective. This is what human solidarity is at its core, struggling together, but still finding joy and meaning in spite of it. Rebelling against the universe that had the gall to let your pleas for meaning fall on deaf ears, showing that if everything is inherently meaningless, you will make something meaningful out of it, in spite of it. And with that human solidarity, with that rebellion, comes a form of self-actualization. You may think that reaching the physical peak represents that, as if it's some visual metaphor for Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but no. That self-actualization comes from the relationships you forge while climbing. The struggle, the assistance, the failure, only to try again over and over. That's where the fulfillment is. That's where you find meaning. In Camus' own words, I rebel, therefore I exist. And even when you do reach the peak, there's still more to do, achievements to unlock, ascensions to master, maps to learn, and you do them together. Finally though, I feel like this goes all the way back to how Peak was developed in the first place. Remember that from the beginning of this video, a collaboration between Landfall and Agrocrab, where the latter was going through a tough time and found solidarity in their friend, where by working together they were able to create something amazing in a short amount of time, that even outsold Agrocrab's Another Crab's Treasure. If that doesn't show you what this game is really about, I don't know what will. So the next time you hear or see someone sneer at a friend slop game, you should remember, Peak isn't about cheap horror or mindless chaos. It's a living demonstration of one of Camus' most hopeful insights, that even in a meaningless universe, we can maybe, just maybe, find value and purpose through solidarity. And if that isn't worth taking very silly things very seriously, then I don't know what is. Before we end this video, a big shout out to Unsolicited Advice's videos about Camus and absurdism, as they really helped with my understanding of the topic and taught me a lot of what I needed to know for this video. Links are in the description. Oh, and by the way, I have access to donations and memberships now on YouTube. I don't really have much to offer at the moment, but if for whatever reason you wanted to show me a little bit of support, then I'd be extremely appreciative. If you can or don't want to, that's fine. It's just an option that's there for the people that really want to, so please don't feel bad. Anyway, this has been Cognizant Pixels. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.